Hello and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere Demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software, and I'm pleased to present Sarah Mitchell, our Director of Customer Success. Today, Sarah is going to be talking about the charts that are available in the list control in the UX. I think it's something you're going to enjoy seeing, but we're also here to answer your questions, and you can type those questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. So let's get started. Hello, Sarah, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
I can. Let me go ahead and make you the presenter.
All right, welcome everybody to another Wednesday Q&A, and I'm excited you're all here. And today we are indeed talking about list charts. So list charts are a new thing that we added with the latest release for data visualizations, building out dashboards, or maybe providing a different way to visualize some information in a list. And these list charts are using a new Alpha Anywhere chart library that we've been developing over the last I think couple years at this point. It was initially designed as part of our Alpha Transform product for our dashboarding, but we are making that same library available to everyone. And one of the first ways that we're doing this is through the list control as a new field type that you can add. It's not a display type for your data. It's a separate field that you add, like you add a button or a static image. Chart is also one that you can add now. And there are 4 types of charts currently available in that list chart. We have line bar, pie, and gauge. With regards to list charts, to configure them, you have to specify the data points for that chart field, and that's calculated using JavaScript. And that JavaScript can pull data from the list row to display. It could pull data from client-side data storage. It can really compute anything that you want to display in there as long as it's happening in JavaScript on the client. And similarly, for some of the color and label settings, those can also be calculated using JavaScript in some scenarios, or if in the case of colors and labels, it could be a static value or automatically assumed from some of the chart. For some of the chart types, the label's automatically assumed. So right now the pie assumes that you're displaying a percentage of something. So the only labels that we currently make available are just a percent tag on that pie chart, which we'll take a look at today in a live demo. So it's pretty short. There's not a whole lot of depth to really explain here with list charts. So we're just going to go straight to the demo here today. And what I've created here is a demo I've put together using the sample chart data that we provide in the list of static data, an example showing how you could reimagine your data as a chart versus a label. And for that, I've pulled the KanBan sample. And then the third one is going to show you how you could use data series published to the client to display that data. And I should have just shown you guys here. Let's just take a look at it. So here's our samples. This chart here is using a new sample data that we've added. When you create a list control and you insert static data, we provide a few static examples. And one of them that we added is called chart. And chart has a set of 10 columns that each have a data point. And what this is showing here is this is graphing those data points as a line that's got some filling and smoothing on it. And then over here is a pie chart. And let me know if you guys can't see this, we can bump up the scale a little bit here. The second example I mentioned is reimagining your data. So this is the KanBan static data that you can use to create a kind of play with our KanBan layout and look at how that works. But I've taken it here, and what I've done is I've taken that. There's a field called category, and that category has several values as prospect, qualified, closed, that kind of thing. And instead of displaying that as just like text, I've translated it into a gauge. So prospect is like a yellow, half filled, qualified is green, proposal blue, and then closed is purple. And then there's one that you don't see here is lost. Lost is just empty. There's no fill on it. So. And then the final example here is pulling data from the data cache, and this will take a moment to load because I'm going up against a SQL table to pull the data down and then processing through it for each individual graph. But this is from the North Wind sample table that we ship with Alpha Anywhere. You can create a connection string to this from the connection string builder. We'll show that when we take a look at this list. And what this is doing is it's listing order dates. And then this little pie breakdown over here is the percentage of each item that was part of that total sale. Unfortunately, because the pie, near as I can tell, can only display percentage, you can't really see what those items are. But we will look at how that's set up. This use case may be not the perfect example, and maybe the pie isn't the correct choice here. But I wanted to kind of show you guys some different ways you can imagine this beyond the basic example that we've provided in the release notes and the documentation, which is just reading data straight out of the list. So that first list that we set up, this is based on static data. And if you want to get the static choices here that are generated, it's down here in sample data. You would open this up and you would pick charts down here. And it's just a bunch of random numbers with some random name values. And if you come over to the fields tab, this is where I've added those two chart types. So we've got a pie and a line. And the way you add a chart is you click add item, you come down here and you pick chart, and then you give it a name, and you click OK. And once you've added that, you can configure it. So let's take a look at pie here. Pie is just a basic circular chart. It's great for showing relations between some data values. And the pie chart here has two different forms. It has your solid fill where it looks like a pie that's got slices out of it. And then there's also an option to turn it into a donut, which adds a hole in the middle. And then some of the chart height and width configuration, label font size location, whether or not you want to rotate it. But really the data points here is what we're going to take a look at, because this is where you're going to define the data that goes into your chart. And for a pie chart, it's pretty straightforward. You need to return an array of values. And this is true of all of our charts right now. So this array is reading those data points out of that list row, data points 1 through 10, and returning it as an array. And that's what gets charted in our pie chart. If we take a look at line's more complicated. It's got a few more settings, such as a fill area and that kind of stuff. But here on the data points, it's the same thing where we're just retaining data point 1 through 10. So it's graphing the same data, but you get a totally different visualization in both cases. The other thing I wanted to point out is this fill color. It says blue here, but if you open up these properties for a lot of them, you can do something like dynamically compute this with JavaScript, which is we're going to look at in our next example with the prospect and the KanBan data. But you can give it a static value or the default value, which is going to get picked by the system. It's got some default values on it for colors. This says blue. You could put any CSS color value in here. It doesn't need to be the text blue. It could be a hexadecimal value, RGBA, whatever you would like here. And it's the same with the line color as well. This doesn't need to be blue. It can be any color you want, defined the same way. And then some of this other stuff, if you would like to restrict your X and Y axis to some larger value, maybe you're looking at something that can have 0 to 100, and you want to graph that, this is where you would set your axis values here. And then a quick note on these height and width properties, all can be computed dynamically, but the height and the width need to be a fixed value. You can't use percentages here right now. So that's just something to be aware of. If you put 100% on the width, it's going to collapse down and it's not going to show anything. So these field types are added to your list layout the same way as any other field type. I've just added line and pie here, and they're just got a default label of line and pie. So that's a pretty basic example that how you would set it up and everything. But I think the ones that are more interesting to look at that I'd like to spend a little more time on are the transformation of your data. So not just taking the value straight out of the row and charting it, but doing something meaningful with it. So this example here is built off of the KanBan data, which is also sample data that you can find in here, sales pipeline for KanBan list. Now, some of you may have seen this in the past when we built a KanBan, but here I'm using it to kind of use that gauge to symbolize like somewhere in the progress of pushing our sales down our pipeline. And that's set up as a gauge. So if we go and look at gauge, you can see there's a lot more settings here for gauge. Defining the data points is what's interesting here. So the way that this is set up is I'm assigning a value of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 0 for lost based on the category that we're in. So this %r is actually an object, a bit of a misnomer there, but it's got 2, 3, 4, 5 values in it. And JavaScript objects can kind of be treated like arrays in that you can look up the value of a property using array syntax, such as what we're doing here. So this here is the exact same thing as, like, assume we were looking for prospect, maybe categories prospect, you would write %r dot prospect. So if data.category is prospect, this here is exactly what this little piece of code here is doing, which is a useful thing to know because now you can kind of do quick lookups with objects without needing to write a loop to search through everything. So that's a little tip there. So this is going to get the value and return it. Now the gauge has a single value, and that value is within a range. Our range is 0 to 4. 0 is lost. 4 is the maximum value you can have. It's closed. And then I've kept the default chart height and width here, but the color is being dynamically computed. And in here with the color, you only have the value. So your data points are going to be returned, and then your color is going to be computed based on the value of your data points, and you have access to that in here. And I've basically set it up. Case 1 is yellow, case 2 is green, 3 blue, 4 purple, and then the default, in case I add a new category later, I'd like to see that flagged for some reason. I return red for that case. But lost being a value 0, it's never really going to have that fill, so having a color in that case technically doesn't really matter in this example. And then the third thing that we have set up here is just returning the label to show on that chart. So by default, it's going to be the value, but you could change it to display some text, which I'm doing here. So we take the value, which is going to be 0 through 4. And this is 0 would be lost. This should not say lost. It's actually 5. 0 would be lost, 4 would be closed, and all our bits in between. So with that, I'm able to translate. Okay, here, go look at it. Translate that text of lost progress wherever we are in the process, somewhere along the way, and kind of show like a progress chart basically, which you can see here. So maybe this is one way you might be able to utilize this. The third one we're going to look at, and which is a bit more involved, but this is pulling just data from an entirely different location and putting it into our list. It's pulling from the client side data series. And if you are unfamiliar with what a data series is, Alpha Anywhere has a thing called a data series editor, and what that lets you do is go out and pull some data down from your database or some source and save it in this ordered form that can then be leveraged in our charting capabilities, but can also be leveraged in other ways. And if you publish your data series to the client, because these are typically up on the server and we don't pull that data down until it's requested. If you put it on the client, you now have access to it in JavaScript while your app is offline and can be utilized in a variety of ways. So this data series, which I've named sales, I created by clicking add, and then I edited it. But if we look at this, it's a SQL data series against the Northwind database, and I've got this custom SQL statement, and you're going to see some errors, but they're benign, so ignore them. But what this does is it gets the order ID, it gets the product ID out of our order details table, gets the product name out of the products table, which is joined on the order details based on the product ID. And it creates a sum for that entry as a total. And I'm ignoring there's a field in our order details that's discount. We're ignoring that for this demonstration to keep it simple. But total is just the total of that line item. So for order 10, 24.8, for product 11, it was 168 was the total for that item. And 1024.8 had 3 items in it for that order. We had our queso, whatever fried meat is, and some mozzarella di Giovanni. But those are the totals in here. What I want to take is take those totals and then put them in the pie chart to visually show you like the split of that order of what each item was. So the data series, I feel, is an easy way to get this set up and down on the client. I don't need to do any, Ajax callbacks to run some Xbasic. Like I can just use the data series builder here to do it for me. And in the definition for this pie, in the data points, I've set it up to call this function get pie data, and I give it the order ID. So I want it to give me back an array of those order totals for the order ID for the current row. And this is the function that I've put together. So there's a few things going on here. And we'll go through them one by one. So when you publish a data series client side, it's going to be available in this dialog object underscore data series data. And the name of the data series is going to be the name you gave it in the builder. So I called it sales. And if you remember back here in the data series editor, that's what we see right here in list name. It's case sensitive. So that's very important to remember, capital S sales. So this is getting just sort of like a variable that I've named orders just to make it easier to work with the data series for all that information we got. And then this next thing, this A5U array series from, it is taking that data series and it's translating it from the form that it's stored in, which is sales has 4 arrays in it. One's called order ID, one called product ID, product name, and total. But that's a bit difficult to search for me conceptually. So what I'm doing here is I'm remapping it into a new array. And each entry in the array is going to have this object that has an order ID, a product name, and a total. So that kind of groups all this stuff together. So I can kind of work with it a bit easier down here. You don't have to do this step. But in terms of explaining this for you, I think this is easier to visualize than trying to explain that the index for the order ID, when we find it, is going to be the same as the product ID and the product name and the total. This next step is find index. I'm just looking for the first entry in our new orders array that matches our order ID. And this right here is a arrow function syntax, and element is the variable passed into it, and then I can do this arrow element order ID is equal to order ID, which we passed in up here. This syntax here is literally shorthand for just return element order ID equal order ID. And you guys are going to see this syntax more as we start venturing into promises in our API, which we just did with the IndexedDB stuff. We have a bunch of functions that use promises, and this is a syntax that you often see when working with promises. But this is a function to test. If the order ID matches the one I'm looking for, it's going to return true, and then I is going to be the index, that first index in the array. If I comes back as -1, it wasn't found, doesn't exist. So then the final piece here is just I make my pie data, and then I have a while loop. And it's very important to note or remember that when you're writing while loops especially if you're using an incrementer, is to increment your value, or you could create an infinite loop accidentally. What we're going to look for is But we're going to check to make sure that I is still less than the length of our orders array because we don't want to walk off the end of it. There's nothing there for us. And for that place that we are in the array, we want to make sure the order ID is still the same order ID. And if it is, we're going to push that total onto our PyData, increment our counter, and keep doing that until we encounter a state either the end of the array or we've moved on to the next order record, and then we'll return our PyData. So that's what this function is doing. The list data itself is from the orders, and the fields, we pulled down all the fields, but we're just including the order date on there. We could put the order ID in there too if we wanted to. But this is joined higher up, basically. The order details that we pulled down are linked to our orders in the database. So we just quickly go over here, go order date in Py and let it load. The reasons the delay there is I have this list set up to load when it's brought into view, because I ran into a situation where the data cache, the data series wasn't actually loaded yet when it was calling into that function to get the data, so I waited. But these are the pie charts. We can open up the Chrome debugger here and take a look at that data series. Let's see here, dialog object dot data series data sales. And this is what I was talking about, how these are separate arrays. But you'll notice that they're ordered. So all our 1024/8s are together, which is going to be the first entry here too, because it's how it's ordered in our database. But here are the three totals, 168, 98, 174. And it's kind of hard to tell, but you know, this is probably our 168, it's probably 174, and down here being smaller is 98. So here are the few ways you can use this. I would like to open up for questions. There is the JavaScript charts now also have an option to insert charts using the AA library. We don't have the documentation yet on setting that up. We are working on it. It's there's a lot to document, so we are working with the dev team. That will be available as soon as we can get it up on our site.
All right, thanks very much for that. So let me see questions here. There aren't really, although someone points out if you move the cursor up and down really fast, it creates a strobing effect, which is a little crazy on our side.
Oh, sorry.
I thought it was cool. Anyway, the other is someone pointed out that highlight on hover is really distracting, and hopefully is there an easy way to turn that off?
There is, yeah. I didn't turn it off on these, but we could do that right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, cool. There is, I think, set 'em hover. Just double checking. So what I usually do is come in here and say no hover. Just give it some sort of class name on the list item hover class name. It doesn't have to exist. In fact, it's probably better that it doesn't exist because if it does exist and it has a background color, you're going to get a different behavior.
Right.
But I put that on that first list. So now if we mouse over it, you're not going to see any highlighting on the hover. Whoop.
Way better.
Yeah.
Could you go back and show that one more time? And not just because that was the only question that's been asked, but also because
you go to list properties.
I'm trying to miss it.
And then you come down into layout properties, and there's this list item hover selected class name.
Yep.
You just give it a class name that doesn't exist, or maybe one that you've set up that the background is none or transparent or something.
So it really could be anything. It could be ABC.
It can be anything, yeah. I use no hover just to sort of remind myself.
So then you remind me, why did I put that there? Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I feel like there's actually a property you could check somewhere that would also disable hovering, but I'm blanking on it right now. But this is the way that I've often done it in the past. So we'll do it for all three here.
Okay.
And list item hover class name no hover, please. Okay. Yeah, so that'll turn it off for all of them.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that was kind of an annoying effect. I'm not seeing any other questions here. So I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to cover, Sarah, or we can give everyone about a minute to type in a question.
Maybe give people a minute to type in a question.
And then we'll do what we do last time, which is close it at 59
Close it
seconds,
early.
just before they hit enter. I know that's annoying, but that
Yeah.
does actually bring me to a good point, which is that if you do have questions at any point, of course, you can send them to guides, GUIDES at alphasoftware.com, and we're happy to get back to you.
Yeah. And I heard a rumor that people really liked last week's slower paced, covering a little bit less information.
Excellent. Yeah,
So
definitely. So
try
keep any
to
feedback
keep
you
these
want.
shorter, and I try to do too much sometimes. So
That's great.
so many things I want to share.
Sarah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's a great webinar. Thank you everyone who showed up today. Again, if you've got questions, send them to guides at alphasoftware.com. We will see you next week at our next Wednesday webinar. Until then, take care and stay well. Bye-bye.